The moment the grid goes down, the first failure is not light, it is time. Refrigeration stops, fuel supply chains stall, and within hours, the modern kitchen becomes a liability instead of a resource. Most people imagine survival cooking as a simple extension of daily life, assuming they will just figure it out when the moment comes. But collapse doesn't give you time to experiment. It compresses decision-making into minutes while your resources degrade by the hour. The real danger isn't hunger, it's the rapid loss of usable calories due to ignorance of heat, chemistry, and preservation. And the harsh reality is this: most conventional cooking methods are designed for abundance, not scarcity. When fuel disappears, those methods don't just become inefficient, they become impossible. The fundamental mistake people make is assuming cooking equals fire. That assumption is deeply embedded in human behavior because, historically, fire was always accessible in some form. But in a modern collapse scenario, especially in dense environments or during widespread outages, fuel becomes one of the most contested and depleted resources. Gas lines shut down, electricity fails, and even basic materials like dry would become scarce or dangerous to gather. What remains is a narrow window where understanding the science of heat transfer, chemical reactions, and microbial control determines whether your food sustains you or poisons you. To understand no-fuel cooking, you have to strip cooking down to its core purpose. Cooking is not about taste, it is about transformation. It is the controlled application of energy to alter the physical and chemical structure of food. Proteins denature, starches gelatinize, pathogens die, and moisture redistributes. Fire is only one way to deliver that energy. The hidden principle most people overlook is that energy already exists in your environment in multiple forms: thermal mass, solar radiation, chemical reactions, and even time itself. The difference between survival and failure lies in whether you can capture and control that energy without relying on traditional fuel. One of the most misunderstood aspects of survival cooking is heat retention. People focus on generating heat, but in a resource-scarce environment, retaining heat is far more critical. Every unit of heat you generate or acquire must be preserved as long as possible. This is where the concept of thermal inertia becomes essential. Materials like water, soil, and dense fabrics can store heat and release it slowly over time. This principle has been used for centuries in traditional cooking methods like haybox cooking, where food is brought to a brief boil and then insulated to continue cooking without additional fuel. In a collapse scenario, this method is not just efficient, it becomes a primary survival strategy. The evidence for this is not theoretical. During periods of fuel rationing in history, including wartime Europe, insulated cooking systems reduced fuel consumption by up to 80% while still achieving safe cooking temperatures. The key lies in understanding that most foods do not require continuous high heat. Once the internal temperature reaches a certain threshold, the cooking process can continue passively if heat loss is minimized. This shifts the entire strategy from active cooking to passive thermal management. Another critical but overlooked factor is chemical heat generation. Certain reactions produce heat without combustion. For example, the hydration of quicklime or the oxidation of iron can generate significant thermal energy. These reactions have been used in self-heating military rations, where water activation triggers an exothermic reaction capable of heating a meal to safe temperatures. In a survival context, similar principles can be adapted using accessible materials, though they require careful handling due to safety risks. The important takeaway is that heat can be engineered, not just burned. Then there is solar energy, often dismissed as unreliable or weak. This misunderstanding comes from a lack of precision. Solar cooking is not about placing food in sunlight. It is about concentrating and trapping solar radiation to achieve temperatures sufficient for cooking and pasteurization. Reflective surfaces, dark containers, and transparent covers can create a greenhouse effect that raises internal temperatures well above ambient levels. Under optimal conditions, solar cookers can reach temperatures exceeding 120 degrees C, enough to cook grains, legumes, and even sterilize water. The limitation is not the energy itself, but the user's ability to design a system that captures and retains it effectively. Microbial control is another area where most people fail under pressure. Cooking is not just about making food edible, it is about making it safe. Without proper heat, pathogens survive, and in a weakened state caused by stress and limited nutrition, even minor contamination can become life-threatening. However, complete sterilization is not always necessary. Pasteurization, which occurs at lower temperatures than boiling, can eliminate most harmful microorganisms. Water, for instance, becomes safe to drink when heated to around 65–75 degrees C for a sustained period. This means that even low-energy systems, including solar or retained heat methods, can achieve safety without reaching a rolling boil. The implications of this are significant. It means that survival cooking is not binary. It is not a choice between fully cooking and not cooking at all. There is a spectrum of thermal processing, and understanding where safety thresholds lie allows you to operate efficiently within severe constraints. This is the kind of knowledge that turns limited resources into sustainable systems. But as conditions deteriorate, another layer of complexity emerges: time. No-fuel methods often require longer durations, and in a high-risk environment, time is not neutral. The longer food is exposed, the greater the risk of contamination, theft, or environmental disruption. This creates a tension between efficiency and security. The solution lies in combining methods, using brief, minimal heat input to initiate cooking, followed by insulated or solar continuation. This hybrid approach minimizes exposure while maximizing energy efficiency. As resources continue to decline, the margin for error shrinks. Small mistakes, improper insulation, incorrect container choice, or misjudging environmental conditions compound quickly. What starts as a minor inefficiency can escalate into complete food loss, and in a collapse scenario, food loss is not an inconvenience, it is a direct threat to survival. The deeper you analyze these systems, the clearer it becomes that survival cooking is not about improvisation. It is about preparation grounded in physics, chemistry, and environmental awareness. The people who adapt are not the ones with the most supplies. They are the ones who understand how to extend the utility of what they have. And this is where the situation intensifies, because once fuel is gone and initial supplies are depleted, you are no longer managing food, you are managing entropy itself. Every action either preserves order or accelerates decay, and the methods you choose will determine which direction you move. As the initial shock of collapse stabilizes into a prolonged resource drought, the problem shifts from immediate survival to sustained efficiency. The body's caloric demand does not decrease simply because fuel disappears. In fact, stress, physical exertion, and environmental exposure often increase energy requirements at the exact moment your ability to process food is compromised. This creates a silent but accelerating deficit. You may still have raw food, grains, legumes, roots, but without the means to properly transform them, their nutritional value becomes partially inaccessible. Undercooked starches resist digestion, proteins remain structurally intact, and antinutrients persist, reducing absorption. The danger is subtle because you are still eating, but your body is extracting less from each intake. Over days and weeks, this inefficiency compounds into weakness, impaired cognition, and increased vulnerability. The common misunderstanding is that raw consumption is an acceptable fallback. While some foods can be eaten without cooking, many staples of long-term storage are specifically chosen because they require thermal processing to unlock their energy. Dry beans, for instance, contain compounds like lectins that are neutralized only through sustained heat. Without proper preparation, they can cause severe gastrointestinal distress, accelerating dehydration and nutrient loss. Rice, another staple, requires gelatinization of its starch granules to become digestible. This process begins around 70 degrees C and depends on both temperature and time. Without reaching and maintaining these conditions, much of the caloric potential remains locked away. The hidden science here is not just about heat, but about the interaction between water, temperature, and molecular structure. Water itself becomes a central variable in no-fuel cooking. It is not only a medium for heat transfer, but also a reactant in many of the transformations required for safe and efficient nutrition. However, water scarcity introduces a competing priority. Using large volumes for cooking may not be sustainable, especially if purification is limited. This forces a shift toward methods that maximize water efficiency. Soaking becomes one of the most critical pre-processing steps. By hydrating grains and legumes over extended periods, you initiate enzymatic activity and soften structural barriers, reducing the thermal energy required for final cooking. In some cases, prolonged soaking combined with mild ambient heat can partially substitute for traditional cooking, though it requires precise timing to avoid microbial growth. This leads to another overlooked principle: controlled fermentation. In a resource-limited environment, fermentation is not just a preservation technique, it is a method of predigestion. Microorganisms break down complex compounds into simpler, more accessible forms, effectively doing part of the digestive work for you. When managed correctly, fermentation can increase nutrient availability, reduce antinutrients, and extend shelf life without any external heat source. The risk, however, lies in mismanagement. Without an understanding of pH, salt concentration, and environmental conditions, fermentation can shift from beneficial to hazardous. The difference between safe lactic acid fermentation and dangerous spoilage is often invisible to the untrained observer. Evidence from traditional societies supports the reliability of these methods. Across regions with limited fuel availability, cultures have developed systems that rely heavily on soaking, fermenting, and passive heat retention. These are not primitive solutions, they are optimized responses to constrained environments. The mistake in modern contexts is dismissing them as outdated rather than recognizing them as highly efficient adaptations. When reintroduced under collapse conditions, they provide a framework for sustaining nutrition with minimal external energy input. But as the situation evolves, environmental variables begin to exert greater influence. Ambient temperature, humidity, and airflow all affect the viability of no-fuel cooking methods. In colder climates, heat retention becomes more challenging, requiring better insulation and smaller cooking volumes to maintain effective temperatures. In hotter climates, the risk shifts toward rapid spoilage and bacterial growth, reducing the safe window for passive cooking and fermentation. This means that no single method is universally reliable. Adaptation must be dynamic, informed by continuous observation of conditions rather than fixed routines. Thermal mass becomes increasingly valuable as a stabilizing factor. Objects that can absorb and slowly release heat, stones, water containers, dense earth, act as buffers against environmental fluctuations. By preheating these materials using any available energy source, including brief exposure to sunlight or residual heat from other processes, you create a reservoir that can sustain cooking over extended periods. The critical insight is that cooking does not need to be a discrete event. It can be distributed across time, with energy input occurring intermittently and retained between phases. Another layer of complexity emerges when considering food safety over time. As cooking durations extend and temperatures fluctuate, the risk of entering the danger zone for bacterial growth increases. This zone, typically between 5 degrees C and 60 degrees C, allows pathogens to multiply rapidly. No-fuel methods often operate within or near this range, making timing and sequencing crucial. The strategy must ensure that food either passes through this range quickly or remains outside it for as much of the process as possible. This may involve initiating cooking with a brief high-temperature phase, using any available means, before transitioning to passive methods that maintain temperatures above critical thresholds. The misconception that survival cooking is simply about making do leads to dangerous oversights. In reality, it requires a higher level of precision than conventional cooking because margins for error are narrower. You are not compensating with excess energy or redundant systems. Every variable, temperature, time, moisture, containment, must be managed deliberately. This is where most unprepared individuals fail. They rely on intuition shaped by abundance, which does not translate to scarcity. As food systems continue to degrade, the psychological component intensifies. Hunger affects decision-making, increasing the likelihood of shortcuts and risk-taking. People may consume underprocessed food out of urgency, ignore early signs of spoilage, or abandon efficient methods in favor of faster but unsustainable approaches. This behavioral shift accelerates resource depletion and increases health risks, creating a feedback loop that is difficult to break without prior knowledge and discipline. The escalation becomes unavoidable when initial reserves are exhausted and you are forced to rely on less ideal food sources, wild plants, foraged materials, or partially spoiled supplies. These often require more complex processing to become safe and digestible. Some contain toxins that are neutralized only through specific preparation techniques involving soaking, leaching, or repeated heating cycles. Without fuel, these processes must be adapted using the principles already established, maximizing passive heat, leveraging chemical and biological transformations, and minimizing loss. At this stage, survival is no longer about maintaining normalcy. It is about operating within a constrained system where energy, time, and safety are in constant tension. The methods you use must not only work, they must scale with declining resources and increasing uncertainty. And as these pressures converge, the gap between those who understand the underlying science and those who do not becomes stark. Because the next phase is not just about cooking, it is about sustaining a system where cooking remains possible at all. And that requires a deeper integration of environment, materials, and human behavior than most people ever consider until it is too late. By the time the system reaches its lowest stability, cooking is no longer an isolated task. It is a continuous negotiation between energy availability, biological risk, and environmental control. At this stage, the margin for improvisation has effectively disappeared. Every action must be intentional, repeatable, and grounded in a clear understanding of cause and effect. What began as a problem of fuel scarcity has evolved into a broader constraint on entropy management, where the goal is not just to prepare food, but to prevent the irreversible loss of usable energy in all its forms. The final misunderstanding that persists even among those who adapt is the belief that efficiency is enough. Efficiency extends resources, but it does not guarantee sustainability. Sustainability requires closed-loop thinking, where outputs from one process become inputs for another, and waste is minimized not just in quantity, but in lost potential. In a no-fuel cooking environment, this means rethinking every byproduct. Water used for soaking becomes nutrient-rich and can be reused in subsequent preparations. Residual heat from one cycle must be captured and redirected into the next. Even the physical arrangement of your cooking environment, placement of containers, insulation layers, exposure to sunlight, becomes part of an integrated system rather than a series of independent choices. The hidden science here is systems thermodynamics applied at a micro scale. In conventional settings, energy is abundant enough that inefficiencies are tolerated. In collapsed conditions, inefficiency is cumulative damage. Each degree of heat lost, each hour of exposure, each misjudged reaction contributes to a gradual decline in system performance. The only way to counter this is through deliberate design. Insulation must be layered to reduce conduction, convection, and radiation simultaneously. Containers must be selected not for convenience, but for their thermal properties, mass, conductivity, and sealing capability. Even the color and surface texture of materials influence how they absorb and emit energy. Evidence from field studies and historical precedents shows that communities under prolonged resource constraints naturally converge toward these optimized systems. During extended sieges, remote expeditions, and isolated settlements, survival was not determined by the presence of resources alone, but by the ability to organize those resources into stable cycles. Individuals who understood how to retain heat, manage moisture, and control microbial processes consistently outperformed those with greater initial supplies but less knowledge. This pattern repeats across different environments and time periods, reinforcing a single conclusion: knowledge compounds while resources deplete. As conditions continue to deteriorate, the role of adaptability becomes critical. No-fuel cooking methods are not static techniques. They are frameworks that must evolve with changing inputs. A sudden drop in temperature, a shift in available materials, or a change in food supply can render a previously effective method inadequate. The response cannot be trial and error under pressure. It must be predictive, based on an understanding of underlying principles. For example, recognizing that lower ambient temperatures will increase heat loss allows you to compensate by reducing batch sizes, increasing insulation thickness, or extending preheating phases. These adjustments are not intuitive, they are analytical. At the same time, the biological dimension becomes increasingly unforgiving. Prolonged exposure to marginally processed food, even if it does not cause immediate illness, can lead to chronic deficiencies and weakened immune response. The body's ability to tolerate suboptimal conditions diminishes over time. This means that maintaining consistent, safe processing standards is not optional. It is essential for long-term viability. The challenge is doing so without increasing energy input, which forces a reliance on precision rather than redundancy. One of the most critical transitions at this stage is the shift from reactive to proactive control. Instead of responding to spoilage, contamination, or inefficiency after they occur, the system must be designed to prevent them. This includes controlling exposure times, maintaining clean handling practices, and ensuring that each step in the process supports the next. The concept of good enough becomes dangerous because small compromises accumulate into systemic failure. In a closed environment with limited recovery options, there is no buffer for repeated mistakes. The escalation reaches its peak when external conditions, whether security threats or resource depletion, interrupt the continuity of your system. A single disruption can cascade, breaking the cycle of preparation, consumption, and recovery. For example, losing access to a consistent water source forces a reallocation of priorities that may reduce cooking capacity, which in turn affects nutrition and physical capability, further limiting your ability to secure resources. This cascading effect is the defining characteristic of collapse scenarios. Stability is fragile, and once lost, it is difficult to restore without significant reserves. The only viable countermeasure is resilience built through redundancy of knowledge rather than redundancy of materials. You may not have multiple fuel sources, but you can have multiple methods for achieving the same outcome. You can understand how to use solar input when available, how to maximize retention when it is not, how to leverage biological processes to reduce energy requirements, and how to combine these approaches dynamically. This layered understanding creates flexibility within constraint, allowing the system to absorb shocks without collapsing entirely. At its core, no-fuel cooking is not a collection of tricks. It is an application of fundamental scientific principles under extreme limitation. It forces a re-evaluation of assumptions that are rarely questioned in normal conditions. Heat is no longer something you generate freely. It is something you capture, store, and defend. Time is no longer a neutral backdrop. It is a resource that can either enhance or destroy your efforts. Food is no longer guaranteed to be safe once prepared. It remains in a constant state of risk that must be managed continuously. The final implication is unavoidable. Survival under these conditions is not determined by strength, speed, or even initial preparedness alone. It is determined by the ability to think in systems, to anticipate interactions, and to execute with precision under pressure. Those who succeed are not improvising. They are applying a framework that was built before the crisis began, refined through understanding rather than guesswork. And when the last accessible fuel is gone, when conventional methods are no longer an option, what remains is not desperation. It is the quiet, controlled application of knowledge against entropy. That is the difference between consuming your resources and sustaining them. That is the line between temporary survival and long-term endurance.